He swore it was an accident, until he received the first letter. The envelope was already waiting on the doormat when Daniel came home that evening. At first, he didn't notice anything strange about it. No stamp, no return address, just his name written neatly across the front. He almost stepped over it, tired from a day that had been unremarkable in every possible way. Only when he bent down to pick it up did a quiet unease settle in his chest, the kind that arrives before reason can intervene. He stood there for a moment, keys still in his hand, staring at his own name. The handwriting was careful, familiar in a way he couldn't immediately place. Inside the apartment, Daniel set the envelope on the kitchen table and walked away from it, as if distance might neutralize whatever it contained. He washed his hands, dried them slowly, listened to the hum of the refrigerator. Ordinary sounds, a normal evening. He told himself there was no reason to hesitate. When he finally opened the envelope, only a single sheet of paper slid out. No greeting, no explanation. Just one sentence, written in dark ink. "You let go." Daniel felt the air leave his lungs. The room seemed to tilt, subtly but unmistakably. He read the words again, then a third time, hoping meaning might change through repetition. It didn't. His fingers tightened around the paper, creasing it as his mind raced through every possible interpretation and discarded them just as quickly. It had to be a mistake, a cruel joke, a message meant for someone else. Yet his eyes were drawn back to the handwriting, the curve of the letters, the pressure of the pen. Details too precise, too intimate. The sentence itself echoed something buried deep in him, something he had spent years refusing to name. Daniel sat down heavily, the chair scraping against the floor. His heart pounded with an urgency that felt disproportionate to a single line of ink.
But his body knew what his mind resisted. No one else knew about that moment. No one else knew about the hand slipping free, about the pause, brief, fatal, before he turned away. He folded the letter carefully, almost reverently, and placed it back inside the envelope. Outside, a car passed. Laughter drifted faintly through an open window somewhere nearby. Life continued, indifferent. Daniel stared at the envelope and understood, with a clarity that frightened him, that something long buried had just found a way to speak. And whatever it wasn't finished. The next morning, Daniel woke before his alarm, the echo of the letter still lingering like a dull ache behind his eyes. For a moment, lying in the half-light of dawn, he almost convinced himself it had been a dream. The apartment looked the same, neatly arranged, meticulously clean, untouched by chaos. He followed his routine with mechanical precision. Coffee brewed at exactly the same strength.
Toast browned to the same shade. His shirt was pressed, his shoes aligned by the door. Daniel took quiet comfort in repetition. Order had always been his way of keeping the noise at bay. From the outside, his life was unremarkable in the safest sense of the word. He worked as an administrative analyst for a small logistics firm, a job that demanded accuracy but little imagination. He spoke politely, rarely disagreed, and left on time. His coworkers described him as reliable, calm, forgettable if they were being honest. Daniel preferred it that way. He avoided questions about his past with practiced ease, steering conversations toward neutral ground. When colleagues spoke about old friends or long-standing relationships, he listened without offering much in return. There were chapters of his life he had quietly sealed shut, and most days that was enough. But as he moved through the morning, the normalcy felt thinner than usual, stretched too tight. At his desk,
numbers blurred on the screen. He reread the same email 3 times without absorbing a word. Every sound, the click of a keyboard, the murmur of voices down the hall, seemed amplified, intrusive. Once, he thought he heard paper rustling behind him and turned too quickly, heart racing, only to find nothing out of place. During lunch, Daniel caught his reflection in the darkened window. His face looked older than he remembered, lines etched deeper around his eyes. There was something guarded in his expression, a vigilance that never quite relaxed. He wondered, not for the first time, when that had begun.
By the time he returned home that evening, exhaustion settled heavily on his shoulders. He told himself again that the letter meant nothing, that it was coincidence or cruelty or confusion. Still, he checked the floor instinctively before stepping inside. The doormat was empty. Relief washed over him, quick, shallow, incomplete. As he locked the door behind him,
Daniel understood that the life he had built, so carefully restrained and painfully ordinary, had only ever worked because the past had stayed silent. And silence, he was beginning to realize, was no longer guaranteed. There were names Daniel used carefully, as if they might break if spoken too loudly. And then there was one he did not use at all. Lucas. The name lived in the quiet corners of his mind, sealed away behind years of deliberate neglect. Daniel had learned how not to think of him, how to redirect his thoughts before they reached that particular door. Most days the strategy worked. He told himself that forgetting was a form of survival. That night it failed. The letter had loosened something. A crack had formed, thin but persistent, and through it came memories he had not invited. Lucas's laugh, too loud, always slightly mocking. The way he used to lean back in his chair, arms crossed, as if daring the world to challenge him. They had been inseparable once.
Bound by years of shared secrets and a friendship that felt indestructible in its certainty. Until it wasn't. Daniel remembered the beginning of the fractures, small disagreements that grew sharper with time, words said in anger, apologies never fully accepted. Lucas had always pushed, always tested limits. Daniel, quieter by nature, absorbed more than he released. Resentment settled between them like sediment, invisible but heavy. There had been a particular look Lucas used to give him in those later days, a mixture of frustration and disappointment that cut deeper than shouting ever could, as if Lucas believed Daniel owed him something and was refusing to pay. Daniel shifted in his chair, rubbing his palms together. The apartment felt smaller now, the walls closer. He stood and walked to the window, staring out at the darkened street below, but the reflection staring back at him was unmistakably unsettled. He told himself this was nostalgia, grief resurfacing, nothing more.
Yet the memories refused to stay vague. He remembered the last conversation they had, though he had spent years pretending otherwise. The tension in the air, the way Lucas's voice sharpened with every sentence, each word landing like an accusation. Daniel had felt cornered, exposed in ways he hadn't known how to articulate. "You always walk away," Lucas had said. Daniel closed his eyes. He had wanted to deny it then. He still did. The past pressed closer, demanding acknowledgement. He could almost feel the weight of it now, the inevitability of remembering what came next. His chest tightened as the edges of that night began to take shape. Not clearly, not yet, but enough to unsettle the fragile balance he had maintained for so long. Daniel exhaled slowly, forcing his thoughts to retreat once more. He wasn't ready to go further, not tonight. But as he turned away from the window, he understood something with quiet dread. The name he refused to speak had already been spoken.
and it was only a matter of time before the rest followed. Memory did not return all at once. It arrived in fragments, sharp-edged and incomplete, like glass pulled from deep water. That night had begun without significance. Daniel remembered thinking it was just another argument, another cycle they would repeat and eventually survive. He and Lucas had met near the overlook outside the city, a place they had gone to countless times before, sometimes to talk, sometimes just to escape the noise of everything else. The road leading there was narrow and poorly lit, winding through trees that swallowed sound. Lucas was already there when Daniel arrived. He remembered the way Lucas stood near the railing, back turned, shoulders rigid. The air was cold, heavier than it should have been, pressing against Daniel's skin. Words came quickly at first, defensive, clipped, rehearsed. Neither of them listened. They never did, Not anymore.
The argument escalated the way it always had, not explosively, but relentlessly. Lucas accused, Daniel deflected. Old grievances resurfaced, each one reopening wounds that had never properly healed. Daniel could hear his own voice, distant and strained, insisting that things were being exaggerated, misunderstood. Lucas laughed then, not kindly. "You never take responsibility," he said. "You just wait for things to pass." That was when Daniel felt something shift inside him. Anger, yes, but also exhaustion. A bone-deep weariness that came from years of feeling small beside someone who always demanded more. He remembered stepping closer, gesturing sharply, his words tumbling out faster now. The wind picked up, rushing past them, carrying their voices away into the dark. What happened next existed in Daniel's mind as a blur of movement and sound. Lucas had stepped back, either in frustration or emphasis. Daniel was never certain which. His heel slipped on loose gravel near the edge. The world seemed to slow, as if offering Daniel time to intervene. Lucas reached out. That part was clear. Daniel saw the fear register on his face, raw and unfiltered. He heard his name, or thought he did. A hand closed around Daniel's wrist, fingers digging in with desperate strength. For a moment, a single suspended moment, everything stopped. Daniel felt the pull, the sudden weight of another life depending entirely on his choice. His muscles tensed, his breath caught. And beneath the panic, beneath the noise, there was something else. Hesitation. He told himself later that it all happened too fast, that there was no time, that shock had frozen him in place. But memory, cruel in its precision, refused to support that lie. He remembered the way Lucas's grip loosened, not because of force, but because Daniel did not tighten his own. He remembered the silence that followed, a terrible, empty pause, before the sound reached him. When it was over, Daniel stood alone by the railing, heart hammering, ears ringing. The darkness below swallowed everything, offering no answers, no absolution. By the time he finally moved, the story had already begun forming in his mind. It had been an accident. He would repeat that word many times in the years to come, until it almost sounded like truth. The second letter arrived 3 days later. Daniel found it in his mailbox early in the morning, resting neatly among bills and advertisements, as though it belonged there. His stomach tightened the moment he saw the familiar handwriting. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he carried it upstairs, every step deliberate, his pulse quickening with each floor. Inside the apartment, he placed the envelope beside the first one, still hidden in a kitchen drawer. The sight of them together made his throat dry. 2 pieces of paper, identical in weight, capable of undoing years of careful denial. The message inside was shorter than the first.
"You heard him." Daniel closed his eyes. The sentence dismantled his remaining defenses with surgical precision. It erased every excuse he had clung to, every version of the story that allowed him to sleep at night. This wasn't a random accusation. It was an echo, accurate, intimate, merciless. He spent the rest of the day in a state of restless vigilance. At work, he flinched whenever someone approached his desk. When the phone rang, his chest tightened, irrational fear blooming with each unanswered call. He began to watch people more closely, studying faces for signs of recognition, suspicion, knowledge. Nothing happened. That evening, Daniel searched his apartment for hidden cameras, for evidence of intrusion. He checked the locks twice, then a third time. He told himself he was being paranoid, that grief and stress were distorting his judgment. Still, he slept with the lights on. The third letter arrived the following night, slipped under his door. This time,
He opened it immediately, hands trembling despite his resolve. "You waited." Daniel sank onto the floor, back against the door, the paper clenched in his fist. The words struck deeper than the others because they named what he had never dared to articulate. Not just what he had failed to do, but the pause itself, the choice hidden inside that pause. He tried to reason his way out. Perhaps someone had been there, a witness who had seen more than the police report recorded. Someone who had waited all these years to speak. But even as the thought formed, it collapsed under its own weight. No one had been close enough to see that moment. No one except him. As the apartment settled into silence, Daniel became acutely aware of a terrifying possibility. The letters weren't exposing new truths. They were simply refusing to let him forget the ones he already knew. Sleep abandoned Daniel quietly, without warning or drama, as if it had simply decided he no longer deserved it.
The first night, he lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling while shadows stretched and shifted along the walls. His mind replayed the letters in a relentless loop, each phrase surfacing just as he began to drift. When he did sleep, it was shallow and fractured, filled with half-formed images that dissolved the moment he opened his eyes. By the third night, exhaustion had settled into his bones. His body reacted before his mind could catch up. His hands shook slightly when he poured his coffee. His heart raced without provocation, then slowed too abruptly, leaving him lightheaded. Food lost its taste. Time lost its shape. He began to feel as though he was watching himself from a distance, disconnected and unreal. The dreams, when they came, were worse. He stood at the overlook again, the wind louder than he remembered, roaring in his ears. Lucas was there, always just out of reach, his face indistinct. Sometimes Daniel tried to speak, but no sound emerged. Other times,
Lucas said nothing at all. He only stared, waiting. Daniel woke drenched in sweat, the echo of that waiting pressing down on his chest. During the day, his senses sharpened to an uncomfortable degree. Ordinary sounds startled him. The creak of the floorboards in his apartment felt deliberate, accusatory. Once, in the quiet of the early morning, he thought he heard a hand sliding against the door from the outside. He froze, holding his breath, listening until the silence returned. At work, he caught himself nodding off mid-task, jolting awake with his heart pounding. His coworkers noticed the dark circles under his eyes, the way his focus slipped, but he brushed off their concern with practiced excuses. Stress, insomnia, nothing serious. Yet beneath the fatigue, something else was growing, a physical manifestation of the guilt he had suppressed for so long. His body remembered what his mind had tried to erase. Each sleepless night felt less like a symptom and more like a sentence. As Daniel lay awake once more, staring into the darkness, a thought surfaced unbidden and unwelcome. The letters weren't punishing him. They were waking him up. The changes did not go unnoticed for long. At work, Daniel's supervisor asked if everything was all right, her concern wrapped in a casual tone that fooled no one. A colleague commented on how tired he looked, offered a joke about deadlines and burnout. Daniel smiled when expected, nodded when appropriate, and deflected every question with the same vague explanations. "Just not sleeping well," he said. "Too much on my mind." They were small lies, harmless on the surface. Necessary, he told himself. But lies had a way of multiplying. He caught himself pausing before answering simple questions, weighing each word as if it carried risk. His stories grew inconsistent. One day he mentioned a headache, the next he blamed stomach pain. He forgot which version he had told to whom, and the uncertainty fed his anxiety. At home, the phone became an object of dread. Each notification made his pulse spike. He stopped answering unknown numbers altogether, letting calls ring until silence returned. Even messages from familiar contacts felt intrusive, as though any interaction might lead to the wrong question. Daniel began avoiding people altogether. He canceled plans, ignored invitations, fabricated excuses with increasing ease. Isolation felt safer. In solitude, at least, there was no one to watch him flinch, no one to notice the way his hands clenched whenever the mail arrived. Yet even alone, he wasn't free. He started to feel watched, not in a literal sense, but with a constant awareness of himself, as if his own thoughts were under surveillance.
Every memory surfaced with an accompanying fear. Is this what the letters will mention next? The smallest details took on new significance. A sentence overheard in a cafe, a word on a billboard. Coincidence became threat. Meaning appeared where none should exist.
One evening, as Daniel stood in his kitchen staring at the unopened drawer that held the letters, he understood something with sudden clarity. The danger was no longer the possibility that someone else knew his secret. It was that he was losing control over how well he could hide it, from others and from himself. The letter arrived on a Sunday morning, when the city seemed to move more slowly, as if even time had lowered its voice. Daniel found it on the kitchen table. He stood in the doorway for several seconds, confused, certain he had locked the apartment the night before. The windows were closed. The door showed no sign of forced entry, and yet the envelope rested there with deliberate calm, placed exactly in the center of the table, aligned with its edges. Waiting. Daniel did not sit down. He did not breathe. His fingers trembled as he reached for the envelope, the paper warm beneath his touch, as though it had been there longer than it should have.
Inside was a single sentence. It wasn't a push, it was a choice. Something inside him broke, not loudly, not all at once, but with a quiet finality that left no room for denial. The words stripped away the last layer of protection he had built around the memory. They named the truth he had spent years reshaping, softening, disguising. Not an accident, not a moment stolen by chaos. A decision. Daniel sank into the chair, the room blurring at the edges. His mind returned to that suspended second by the railing, the weight of Lucas's body pulling against him, the fear in his eyes, the sound of his breath catching. He had told himself that panic had paralyzed him. But now, without the comfort of that lie, the memory sharpened. He remembered the thought that flashed through him then, brief and shameful and devastatingly clear. If I hold on, nothing changes. The arguments would continue, the demands, the resentment. Letting go had felt for an instant like release.
The realization made his stomach twist. Daniel pressed his palms flat against the table, grounding himself in the present, but the past refused to loosen its grip. The guilt he had carried for years suddenly had shape and language. It was no longer something that happened to him. It was something he had allowed. Tears came without warning, silent and hot, blurring his vision. He hadn't cried at the funeral. He hadn't cried in the years since. Grief had always been easier to manage than responsibility. The letter lay open before him, calm and unyielding. For the first time, Daniel did not try to argue with it. He whispered the truth aloud, barely louder than breath, and felt its weight settle fully into his chest. I chose. And with that admission, he understood that whatever was coming next would not be an accusation. It would be a reckoning. That night, Daniel took out a notebook he hadn't touched in years. It was an old one, its cover bent and softened by time.
The pages yellowed at the edges. He sat at the kitchen table beneath the single overhead light and opened it with deliberate care, as if the act itself required permission. For a long moment, he simply stared at the blank page, pen resting uselessly between his fingers. When he finally began to write, the words came slowly. Not the version he had rehearsed for himself, but something raw and uneven. He wrote about the argument, about the overlook, about the moment when Lucas's hand had wrapped around his wrist. He wrote about the pause, the space where everything could have gone differently. His hand cramped. He kept going. Halfway down the page, Daniel stopped and reread what he had written. The confession looked foreign in ink, heavier than it had ever felt in thought. Seeing it there made the consequences tangible in a way imagination never had. He imagined handing it to the police, to a lawyer, to anyone who would read it and understand. Fear surged. With a sharp, frustrated motion, Daniel tore the page out of the notebook. The sound was loud in the quiet apartment, final and violent. He crumpled the paper in his fist, then smoothed it out again, unable to decide what he wanted to destroy. He tried a second time, then a third. Each version ended the same way, unfinished, folded, hidden.
He slid the pages into the back of a kitchen drawer, beneath old receipts and forgotten keys, as if disorder might camouflage truth. By the time he closed the notebook, his hands were shaking. Daniel understood then that confession was not a single act. It was a threshold, and he was standing just close enough to see what waited on the other side, yet still unwilling to cross. The truth hadn't left him. He was simply refusing to let it go anywhere else. Daniel drove out of the city just before dusk, the sky dimming into a flat, colorless gray. He hadn't planned the trip. The decision came quietly, without debate.
As though some part of him had already accepted that this was inevitable. The road was the same, narrow, winding, bordered by trees that leaned inward, obscuring the view ahead. With each turn, memory pressed closer. His hands tightened around the steering wheel, knuckles pale, his pulse loud in his ears. When he reached the overlook, the place was empty. He parked and stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at his face. The railing stood exactly where it always had, unremarkable, almost ordinary. Daniel approached it slowly, every step measured, as if moving too quickly might trigger something irreversible. He rested his hands on the metal and looked down. Darkness swallowed the space below, offering no sense of depth or distance. The wind rose and fell, carrying the same hollow sound he remembered, a low, restless hum that seemed to vibrate through his bones. Daniel closed his eyes. He could see it again, the sudden movement, the shock on Lucas's face.
The weight pulling away from him. His stomach tightened, his breath shallow. He felt as though the past was leaning over his shoulder, waiting. That was when he noticed the envelope. It lay on the ground near the railing, held in place by a small stone. Daniel stared at it, disbelief flickering briefly, before giving way to resignation. Of course it was here. Of course it had followed him. He picked it up with careful hands and opened it. Inside, the message was shorter than any before. Do you remember the sound? Daniel's chest constricted. He did remember. He remembered the sudden silence after the grip broke. He remembered the delayed echo that followed, reaching him only after it was already too late. The memory struck with devastating clarity, and Daniel understood that this place was no longer just a setting. It was a witness. Daniel didn't open the letter again when he returned home. He already knew what it contained: memory, accusation, certainty. Instead,
He stood in the center of his apartment, coat still on, the silence pressing in from all sides. Something had shifted at the overlook, not resolved but clarified. The letters were no longer chasing him. They were guiding him. He went to the kitchen drawer and pulled it open. The envelopes lay there, side by side, creased and worn now from being handled too many times. Daniel took them out and spread them across the table. For the first time, he examined them not as threats, but as objects. The handwriting drew his attention again. He fetched the old notebook from the shelf and flipped through its pages, stopping at the discarded confessions near the back. His breath caught as he laid one of the torn pages next to the letters. The alignment of the strokes, the slant of the letters, the pressure where the pen had dug too deeply into the paper. They matched. The realization settled slowly, inexorably, like a truth that had always been waiting for him to stop resisting.
There had been no intruder, no hidden witness, no long silent avenger stepping out of the shadows. There had only ever been him. Daniel sank into the chair, a strange calm spreading through his chest. The fear that had ruled him for days began to dissolve, replaced by something heavier but more stable: understanding. The letters weren't messages from the outside world. They were fragments of memory he had locked away, resurfacing now that his defenses had weakened. Each one had arrived precisely when he was ready, when his mind could no longer maintain the fiction that protected him. He thought of the notebook, of the way his hand had written the truth without permission, of the pause by the railing, of the years he had spent living beside a secret he pretended was harmless. The mind, he realized, had its own sense of justice. Daniel gathered the letters and placed them carefully back into the drawer, this time without hiding them beneath anything else.
He left the notebook open on the table. For the first time since the letters began, he felt no urge to destroy or escape. The truth had stopped knocking. It was already inside. Daniel stopped going to work a week later. No announcement, no dramatic decision. He simply didn't return. The world continued without him, as it always had, but he felt no urgency to rejoin it. The days passed quietly, marked by long stretches of silence and moments of sharp clarity that arrived without warning. He didn't turn himself in. He didn't destroy the letters either. They remained in the drawer, unchanged, no longer accusatory, just present. The notebook stayed open on the table, its unfinished pages waiting, though Daniel rarely added to them now. There was nothing left to explain. The truth no longer needed words. Friends stopped calling. Coworkers moved on. Isolation wrapped itself around him, not as punishment, but as consequence. He accepted it without resistance. Some nights, Daniel dreamed of the Overlook again, but Lucas no longer reached for him. He simply stood at a distance, watching, expression unreadable. There was no anger in his gaze, no forgiveness either. Daniel woke from those dreams with the same understanding each time. Justice had not come from the outside. There were no handcuffs, no courtroom, no sentence spoken aloud. Yet every morning when he opened his eyes, the weight was there, steady, undeniable. He carried it into the kitchen, into the quiet hours, into the empty days that followed. It shaped every thought, every breath. The world had never demanded his confession. His conscience had, and that, Daniel knew now, was a life sentence with no possibility of appeal.